Any order at all? So we've never tried this before. We're getting people to ask questions from the audience. So hopefully this will be okay. I'll just move my chair around slightly. So guys, keep asking questions and keep voting for the questions that you want in. We'll see them live coming up at the top of the screen. And the first question that we have, and I don't know who's going to start with this one, is, now I've never personally heard of 8D. I mean, I think we're still struggling. As we've discussed at L35, we were talking about 3D and 4D. So health and safety, from a BIMobject perspective, could be something very, very interesting. Who wants to kick off on creating a health and safety building using objects and having it arranged? Anybody want to kick off that question?
Well,
L35 can.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not responsible for it. But we see that many of the actors, especially in the site, just don't have the knowledge or don't push that hard for BIM. Especially some providers, I mean, I'm talking about local providers, don't have that knowledge. So I see that probably clients or even the construction company should put some of the knowledge that they have or of the teams that they have to help all these people inside, to be able to push and not miss the opportunity of losing some of that information along the way. So I think really construction site is sometimes the weakest point of the chain in this case.
Does Andy agree with that kind of statement that the construction site is the weakest point?
It depends on which country and which construction company.
Yep.
I think there are a few of the Scandinavian companies that might disagree. At least they're trying to disagree. I wonder about health and safety. What type of health and safety? Because in terms of fire ratings and some things like that, that is carried through in your model and model objects, and then eventually, I guess, your digital twin. So hopefully, if anyone goes to do renovation, there's a red flag in the system. That department has fire-rated walls. You're going to have to seal up after you make any holes. So in some ways, it already is, but it depends on what you're asking, what type of health and safety.
I'm going to jump over to Torben as well. I mean, we saw an excellent example earlier of people using publicly available data to create an app. It was a result from the hackathon that we weren't expecting from an AEC perspective. I mean, Copenhagen provides a huge amount of data publicly that could be used as a health and safety example.
That's true. It's publicly available for anyone to apply, which was beautifully illustrated in the hackathon. I think one thing I might add is more and more companies that we're working with are thinking along the lines of behavioral objects, so to speak. So how can we model, how can we estimate the behavior going on in buildings, in open spaces? We see that within acoustics, fire regulation, fire escape routes in building models, etc., etc. How can we model and be more precise in the modeling of the behavior going on within a building, within an office space, etc., etc. And personally, I'm very interested in that because I think that presents a fundamental change in the thinking of how we build. What kind of business models the industry will look at in the years to come, focusing on not only the modeling of objects, but also the modeling of the behavior going on in the buildings. I think we were in for a major transformation when we talk about modeling the behavior rather than just the physical objects.
I think that's a very good point, and I think it brings us quite nicely onto our next question, and I'm going to throw it over to Marcus as the manufacturer on the stage. The information and the objects that are being provided, I mean, who is responsible, who should be responsible, where, as a manufacturer, how do you feel about this? Because you provide many, many objects, obviously, to the many users that we have.
Yeah, at the beginning, it's very easy. The manufacturer is responsible for the object, but this is the lack of the technology at the moment. If you put the object into Revit or Archicad, you can change it then. And because architects can change values in the object, so the responsibility of the object is transferred in this moment to the designer, not anymore to the manufacturer. because there's no technology yet there that you can say, okay, the information I provided as a manufacturer in this moment, based on my company information, it's still the same if it's used in the model. So the transfer of information and the adding or changing of the content of the model brings the situation that the object is changed, and then the responsibility is in the hand of the designer.
So then throwing that over to the architects to respond, I think is quite a good, you guys consume a huge amount of content from us and build those great big models. Obviously, Bernbau is just one project which you showed. How do you feel kind of like, obviously you are absorbing information. How do you feel about the responsibility of those objects being placed in those models?
Well, I think
Answer that.
I think legally we're responsible. I mean, no matter if we think we're not. I mean, liability is an open thing. I mean, not even in Europe. It's not really the same in France than in Spain, but definitely most of the time we have the liability of the model and the information that has the model. So we're used to it. So we try anyway to feed the model as much as we can, because what you get in return is so much better. So I think it's not about really the liability, it's what you can do with that data. Maybe you don't know you can do it now, but we find that you end up using it after some time. So yeah, we're responsible for it, so it's okay.
The answer's there, guys. They are responsible as architects. But, but I think it is a very good point. I mean, it's valuing the data that is inside, and it is probably a maturity of the industry that we are going through. We'll skip on to the next question, which is one that I really, really like. Who wants to start with this one? So, I mean, Stefan spoke about it, first of all, us thinking about total life cycle cost, and obviously looking at products based on their actual performance over time. As a consulting group, and as those kind of run these huge projects, as you showed, how should we really be approaching that in the right way to choose those right products for the 50-year life cycle?
You're throwing that to me, aren't you?
Yeah, I am throwing that to you. Sorry.
We should do everything we can to push for the more sustainable option over time. It really depends on the client, though, whether you're able to sell that. But at any rate, I do think even with, for instance, public money, where they have to report back, and it's a very limited budget that you can't go over, if you can lay the data out on the table, you can get a little closer. You might not get the most sustainable choice. But often buildings, the big projects last longer than the client or the client representative. Whether it's politicians, you'll go through another election cycle, whole new client. So it's hard for them. They want immediate results.
But do you think it's too hard today? I think it's one of the questions. I mean, Marcus, you touched on EPD data, but going back, is it really difficult to do on a day-to-day basis?
It is very difficult. It's getting easier with the ability to show data, though. Especially if you can publicize your data and say, look, this is public knowledge that if we did it this way, it would be more sustainable. It gets harder and harder to argue against that, I think.
I mean, Marcus, you did a fantastic job talking about EPDs, which maybe many people have never heard of before. I mean, the data is there, right? I mean, you guys, you manufacturers, you sit on it. What's the big barrier from, you guys do a fantastic job, but what is the big barrier of making it much easier for Anne's team to kind of drive this kind of sustainable route?
On the one hand side, you have the data in the EPD, which is covering all the internal knowledge here about life cycle and global warming, primary energy, and all the stuff there. But then on the other hand side, there's the user who's responsible for maintenance, and you put in data there in the EPD, which are not really guaranteed. So it's a simulation of the data at the moment. So if there's no agreement about the life cycle duration of a material and or a construction, and you can choose it by yourself. If you say, okay, my painting will last 12 years or 20 years without maintenance, then it's here clearly that you can do everything with it. So you can spread the cost over 20 years, you can spread the cost over 50 years, and as you saw here in one of the presentation here, that's the total life cycle cost between the different construction methods are not depending on really on the building. Most of the costs in the construction are coming in from the operating phase, so especially in global warming and primary energy use. So the building material, if you have the closed loops there, it's not a problem here anymore. So we can calculate it. We need to set up rules about the lifespan of a material, and then to say, okay, clearly calculate it according to this regulation. And this is something we have it in Germany. We have a database which clearly stated, okay, a life cycle of an attic system has only 25 years or 30 years or 40 years, depending on the insulating material you are using. So you must use this data, and then you can collect it. And the BIM model allows us to take out the quantities and bring the data together and to calculate it. So I don't agree, so that's so difficult, but we must agree on the framework around what to do.
So, I mean, that is a really good point, and it kind of brings us on to quite nicely to our next question. We also touched on it earlier today, which is kind of, where are governments in this? I mean, do governments understand life cycle costs? I mean, from a Copenhagen point of view, I mean, I'd say that is probably a fantastic example of a yes. Would you agree in that talk?
To some extent, yeah, definitely, because it has to do with the stability of the building owner. And as you rightly put it, you're up for election every 4th year, and then there's a new boy in town and a new agenda every 4th year. But in the Copenhagen case, I think there's been, you might like it or dislike it, agree or not politically. I'm not going to go into that discussion, but we have seen a political stability over a 20-year time span now. So in that respect, the decisions having been made have been implemented. So in that case, we're quite fortunate. But if you move outside the public domain, I think, especially looking at the Danish experiences, it's the pension funds that are ruling the game. I think that the ability to have long investments, stable investments with a good influx of cash, of course, due to the very, very long time span on building projects, I think that is a prime mover, or that's a prime driver for the pension funds. So in that respect, yes, they are focusing on life cycle costs, and I think to a certain extent, which I think is as important as the life cycle cost, the life cycle value of the buildings. I think we are not focusing enough on that aspect. What is the overall value? What's the life cycle value of a building, of an office space, of a school, of a hospital, etc., etc., and how does that value creation actually impact the business models of construction, the consultant fees, etc., etc. I think we are up for a major, not necessarily transformation within the next 5 years, but I certainly see, coming out of a Danish tradition, we are up for a fundamental new discussion on new business models, new consultant fee models, etc., based on the focus of impact-based models rather than input-based models.
I mean, we have a speaker tomorrow who is from a VC coming to speak to us about sustainable investments, especially into the construction industry. I mean, and it is a very good point. I mean, L35 as an architectural practice, are you seeing a maturity move from the client, whether it be public or private, in kind of really requesting, don't just build it cheaply, build it so it will last? Is that the kind of conversation that's moving across?
Well, developers always want to do something for the least amount of money possible, and they want it to last the longest. And so it is ironic that I think governments, or at least the ones that we deal with, are not very concerned about the life cycle of the buildings. They don't really care about that. It's actually something that you have to push. Insurance companies are very concerned about that. I think it's a value that they are adding to the buildings. Investment companies are concerned about that, but governments, we haven't seen that yet. And there is a concern about the maintenance of those, the maintenance of the asset. in a way, that it doesn't go into a ruin, even either physical or financial. But it's not. It doesn't drive the activity in a way. Clients are concerned of those issues, and they mix it with all the new concerns about BREEAM, about LEED, and about all that. But many times, just with the concern of profitability in the long run. There is not a real concern about the use of the building. Now there are all the tendencies with co-working and some other interests that I think implement those concerns on the side of the clients. But I think, at least from our point of view, at the least in the market, at the least number of clients that are concerned about this.
Well, I totally agree. It's a microscopic portion of the business. I think just going ahead 10 years, maybe not even 10 years, I think that agenda will change. Yes, because we will have to focus on the value being created by the industry rather than just the input. And I think that change, you see it, but you're right, of course, you only see it very at a very small level. Let me just give you two very short examples.
Keep going.
I think if you look at the at schools, for example, and the ever-rising agenda on indoor air quality and the consequences of good and bad indoor air quality on learning of kids. Why shouldn't the team behind building schools not be valued according to the learning going on in the schools, for that matter? That's a completely new mindset of actually creating value as a consultant, as a contractor, rather than just being valued by the input put into the building. Hospitals is the same matter. We have a small, very small hack in Bloxup with one of the tenants there, and we've agreed to tear up the classical renting agreement by focusing on the value this company creates by being part of our Urban Innovation Hub. And of course, the major discussion there is, what criteria are we talking about? CSR, value creation, bottom line, top line, results, etc., feedback from employees, etc. So it's my point just being it's a whole new ball game of a complex set of criteria you have to identify in order to create a value-based model rather than an input-based model. So I totally agree the difficulties, but I just find the agenda very interesting, and I think it's there, and it will be becoming more and more apparent in the years to come.
Yeah. Well, I think it's improving, actually. I agree with you that it's improving by small increments, but it is improving. Yeah. We find a set of clients that have a certain interest, and it very much depends whether they keep the building for a number of years or they're planning on selling the building right away. There is another aspect of what you just mentioned, which are the users. The users, many times in this process, do not appear. They don't appear until the very end. And everybody keeps interpreting the user all the time, throughout the process, but nobody asks the users. Or they don't even know who the user is going to be sometimes. So, and it is an important aspect, because the user, as you mentioned, adds value to those properties, whatever they are, and but it's not taken into consideration in some.
I mean, do you think? I mean, we've all been here. Just out of interest in the audience, who here before today had not heard about the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN? Don't be shy. 1, 2. Everybody knew about them. 3. Okay, that's pretty good. Do you think that the Sustainable Development Goals could be? I mean, you've just said, Torben, a second ago, the 5 to 10 years. I mean, in your experience, could the Sustainable Development Goals, because you mentioned them in your presentation, Anne, could they be that catalyst? Could they be the drive for governments to really kind of step forward and go, yeah, we need to create better buildings and schools. We need to think about air, and we need to think about water. We need to think about education and those sorts of things.
I think so.
That is exactly the answer that I want. That's fine. Yes is good.
You just have to get, for instance, politicians to go on record saying this, and then it's hard to argue. You know, you can prove your case.
So one of the things that we come across at BIMobject quite a lot is education. We provide a lot of education in BIMobject. I think all of us probably in parts of our roles, regardless within our organizations, provide education at varying levels. I mean, you guys did a great story on you showed where you went wrong. You did what you knew at the time, and then in hindsight, you're like, oh, there's better ways to do it. How do you go about those sorts of things, and how do you bring an organization along with you to be better at this?
I'll make one comment, and you probably have some additional ones. I mentioned that during the presentation. You have to have architects and that have a special training, and I think BIM forces you to have a greater knowledge than before because of all the elements that come together. In a way, we call it building on paper, because you solve problems. So you need to solve all the problems that you're going to face during construction. Many times projects, even before AutoCAD or even with AutoCAD, didn't solve all the problems. They were drawn, but they weren't solved. And BIM, one of the advantages that it has is that it forces you to solve the problems before construction. So it improves the result, the end result. But it forces architects and engineers to know how this whole thing comes together. You need to know that. So you need to know much more about construction.
But also then, if you want to know about how things go together, do you feel that there is an absolute need? I mean, many of the people in the audience make things to build buildings. Do you feel that really does need to bring together both the architectural community and the manufacturing community to understand how we make things? Because we just design stuff and put it out, and then we just build it.
Yeah, that would be I was going to say it would be a second part of it, but probably is a primary part of it. I mean, the manufacturing world, just as we were talking about, users need to know what are the demands and what is it that you need to do. So there has to be a much more interaction. We find nowadays that many of the manufacturers, we deal with many of them, and they come to the office and we expose the situations, the problems and all that. There's a lot of exchange and there's a lot of adaptation on that, much more than it was before.
So Marcus, I mean, are you seeing that, obviously, to help drive education? Obviously, manufacturing is a very traditional industry, much like construction. They are separate, but the same. Yep. I mean, are you finding from a BIM point of view, you are getting more involved in architectural projects, but also within your organization itself, getting education about BIM out?
So you see a total change in organizations there, because if you want to be part of a BIM project, you need to have not any more sales reps who are knocking on the door and say, okay, I will sell you something. You must have advisors who are able to understand the need of the architectural design and to say, okay, what is really the demand there? And then to understand, to bring the performance of the products, especially to this project here. And also to say, okay, maybe I don't have for this the product I have selected before, when I saw the design. So to say, to understand here the need, for example, there's a higher fire rating, so you change the product here to a different product. So, but for this you need to train on the manufacturer side all your sales reps here in a way that they are able to understand the process of BIM and a new way of collaboration. But on the other hand side, we have that problem. If you see as a building manufacturer, you step into a project, but you don't know if you will deliver the material at the end of the day. So we are the normal way, you give 5 offers to win 1 project. So, but in a BIM project, if you work in a collaboration at a very early stage, normally you must say, you select the manufacturer, especially based on the performance of the building materials at the beginning of the project, and it's fixed then there, because then you have all the data coming from one manufacturer over the whole life cycle, the data, and you can put it in the project. Otherwise, you have the situation of apple and pears, like I show. So if you change the material during the construction process, all ideas from the beginning are away.
I mean, and at Ramble, your colleague who can't be here today, they're involved in the Tesla Gigafactory, and you guys get involved in some amazingly exciting projects. I mean, that sort of projects, that kind of profile, and other ones that you do, there must be a conversation of education between. I mean, you deal with lots of consultants, between the architects, the manufacturers, the engineers, and people like yourselves. That must be happening in these projects now.
It absolutely is. And even on projects where you aren't allowed to specify a particular manufacturer, if there's public funds involved, for instance, if there is a product or a manufacturer that produces a product that is so perfect for your needs, one of the things you can do with BIM is you can then say, these are the needs I have for this object, but you can't specify a manufacturer. But if you're able to put that much information in, then it basically limits them to the one manufacturer that you do think is right, within reason. You know, you obviously can't go very, very high end or something just for looks, but if it's actually for how it functions.
But I think this is a really interesting road that we're kind of going off key slightly to the questions. Sorry, guys, but it goes to a very interesting question about procurement, buying stuff. And you know, a lot of our users talk about on BIMobject, oh, we can't specify things because it's for public sector. And we know that's not the case now. And we've seen it, evidently we've been out and asked our users what they actually think about this. And it is that or similar. With the DFMA program coming forward, which Stefan said earlier about basically mass producing buildings. Do you think this kind of requirement, this information about we should have this because it's perfect, will come in? I mean, Copenhagen, you guys are doing fantastic experiments on mass producing things like student housing, for example. There must be a controlled supply chain for that, surely.
There definitely is, but I think going back to the discussion before about the role of the public sector, I think the role there is massive, especially at a city level, where you are forced to look ahead. You are forced to demand something which takes into account the life cycle costs, as we discussed earlier. I think they, in taking the Danish case again, which is the one I know the best, of course, there's a national mandate on BIM. So if you have, in just a few years' time, any public project will have a BIM mandate requiring BIM or 3D, 4D, 5D models to be used there, which pushes the training, which pushes the competence development within the industry, etc., etc. But also opens up for another discussion, which is not necessarily apparent here, but what's the role of the SME? Because going to the Nordic scene, the majority of companies within the building industry is SME. So what's the role there? What are their training abilities? What's the driver there? Personally, I think it's a mindset shift we need. I think more and more companies will be born digital. Also within the construction industry. We see that in architectural practices, small and medium-sized companies being born digital. And within the construction phase, we see that more and more. It's not a fast-moving train, but it will be a train moving forward, just alongside the other agendas we discussed.
And it brings us into our next question about the change to the current building process. I mean, in the design process for the Bernabeu Stadium, for example, you went through a number of different design kind of processes and ways, and you started using kind of Rhino and Dynamo scripting, which are very advanced kind of systems, been around for a while, but are still fantastically powerful. I mean, do you see that as kind of a big change into, you know, creating this digital transformation in the industry to be able to work in a truly digital way?
I believe so. You really have to take advantage of your data. So it doesn't really matter if you use one program or not. You have to link them all. And like the Revit really wasn't really able to do an easy process of parametrics like Rhino was. So it's all about finding your training. We had to go to the market, find that knowledge, put it inside the firm, and sit this super BIM expert in the table to come up with a sort of geek architect that tried to have all the different elements needed for that. So I think architects or design, we've been implementing all kinds of new technologies from since the very beginning. I mean, the draftsman, so I don't think it's the easiest part. I think really the construction process is the one that has to be really thought and really about all the needs and that all the different builders need, and to be able to have all the technology needed to have a continuous chain, because maintenance is something that already uses BIM constantly. So we have these two areas, and we really have to work through all the chain to make sure that all the design and all the data is preserved and used.
Yeah, so that's very interesting talking about your data and the chain coming through. I mean, Marcus, as a manufacturer, a very large one, how are you thinking about providing your data? Basically, this is kind of your client group here on stage that are responsible for designing and buying your products, potentially. And I know, if you don't mind me saying, you're a bit of a data geek at Zeller. I mean, how important is that for manufacturers really to jump on board with?
So the data are available. That's the first thing. And manufacturer must understand that these data are not internal data, that the data can be given out here to architect, to structural designer, to the building physics, and to be used in the model. And I think the most important thing is there, that the data are exchangeable between the different systems, and you don't lose data on the way if you transfer from one system to another system, and then you need to edit again manually or download it again. So we must understand that the data are from the beginning of a project in this model are there, geometrical and non-geometrical data, all kind of data, and you must take them out in the right moment, the amount of data you need for your purpose. It doesn't make sense if you have, in our case, we have for AAC block something about 250 attributes we can share. But most of the attributes are for the architect are not of interest if there are group holes in the block. So nobody cares about it. But for the construction companies, it's important because it speeds up the building process a little bit. So every time you must decide which kind of data you read, but in the model, there must be all data of the building products.
Which brings us potentially, interestingly, onto international standards. They are a great question, whoever asked this. I mean, from a standards point of view, does it really matter? I'm going to take this question in this direction. I mean, at Ramboll, obviously, you work all over the world. Like, does it matter? What do you do when you get this stuff in, and how do you deal with it from a data perspective?
From a data perspective, no. From a law perspective, yes. For instance, one of the apps that I showed is most of the preloaded data is actually for the UK. So then
UK standards.
Woo, UK standards. But then that means that you then have, I mean, I guess eventually it will come down to just knowing which data to swap out and having an easy swap. That's the hope.
I mean, and in Copenhagen, you have all these data sets that are readily available. Are they in a certain standard, or are you just basically flooding the market with data and just going, see what you can do with it?
See what we can do. Well, to be honest, yes. Because we don't have the answer yet. So the mindset here is seeing this from the viewpoint of the Copenhagen city, for example. Yes, we are putting all these publicly available data on the market, so to speak, in order for companies to have a go and to see what can be done. But I would say that's at some point in my presentation I talked about the living labs, and I think it's very much from an innovative point of view, and we are still there in order to see, okay, if we make all these publicly available data and push them out there, if we make them publicly available, what will happen? And that's sort of a very innovative question. It's a prototyping question. We don't have the answers yet. We can just see more and more companies are actually picking up the different data. The Safe Step app that was beautifully illustrated is just one very, very tiny example, but a great example of what actually happens if you dive into this sort of massive ocean of data being publicly made available from a public body as the Copenhagen city. Great. So in that respect, I think it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile.
So this question about BIM on the construction site, I'm actually going to throw over to the architects first, because I think it's quite interesting, because basically you are producing, as you showed, an amazing amount of information. How would you like that to be used in the construction site, I suppose, in an ideal world? And then we'll hear from Anne on how it may be consumed from her experience on the construction site.
Okay, so maybe a way of doing this is providing a BIM manager that helps all the different providers, and they have a fee in order to feed the system and to avoid doing things the old way, the old-fashioned. Those that do have the knowledge and do have the teams could not use that service, but I think it's really important to have it. So that's one way of not losing that BIM knowledge through the construction site.
But I think it has to do with the motivations. I mean, if a construction company wants to follow all the data, all the information, everything that has been built on the process of the project, they could do it. Now, they want to modify certain things, they want to adapt certain things, because each construction company is a bit different as well. So the break happens there when the interest and the motivations are a bit different. And in a way, I think BIM facilitates many issues, because many of the products that could be changed, or they may not be available within the construction calendar, actually modifying something or substituting something, if the information is there, is rather easy. So it should be easier if you handle and you manage your BIM tools correctly. It should be much easier. But the motivation has to be there. And now I think the construction industry needs to adapt to this process. But it's happening at the same time.
Happening.
It's happening slowly, but it's happening.
In your experience, Anne, I mean, I'm going to come on to Marcus. Do you agree? How do you guys are kind of dealing with it right now?
Yeah, it's happening slowly. Some of the bigger construction companies are starting to see the value in using the BIM model and maintaining it. Maybe some of the smaller ones.
Yeah, it's the smaller ones that don't have that knowledge are the difficult ones.
Yep. But also, I guess if you have a mandate from the client, for instance, I had one really large project where the client didn't know about BIM and then found out about it and was like, this is great, and actually stole one of our junior BIM managers and put them on site, and it worked brilliantly. But, so.
Well, we stole our BIM instructor. It is in the office
you
now.
Do what
he
you
was was training the groups and said, come to us. It happens.
Torben, you had a point?
Well, I just coming back to the point about the operational, I think the data coming out of the maintenance and the operation, of course, if you're a serial builder, you need that operational knowledge going into the model and the programming of the next buildings. And I think you stated earlier that the national or the governments don't really care about the cost. I think to some extent you're very, very right. But being a serial builder, you need the knowledge, you need the learning going into the next project. And then I think in that respect, BIM is a fantastic example of how you can actually do that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in an ideal world, being a product manufacturer, and obviously from Melbourne's point of view, if the architects, I'm not saying that you don't, by the way, but if the architects would deliver to you a a model which was full of BIM objects, which were real things. Everything in there was purchasable and deliverable on site. How much easier would that be for you as an organization? Because you have everything there that's real. None of it's made up. It's all from real manufacturers to help you on the construction site. How much better will that be for Ramboll if that was delivered to you?
Well, that's happening, and it does make things a lot easier. Where the hiccup lies is still on the construction site, though, with substitutions, because those don't get tracked. Which means if you are working towards a digital twin, or you want to be able to hand over something, and then the maintenance of the building is tied to a model, and they're actually continuing to maintain and use that information, the model that you hand over may be nothing like what gets built. I mean, I've had as-built drawings on napkins come back to me, and I'm supposed to try and put those into my model and update it. You know?
But why would something be switched out, though? I mean, if they're delivering a model, is it because things aren't just being delivered on time? What's the usual reason for that sort of behavior?
Timescale, but also oftentimes, and this is usually a public sector issue, if a new ramavtal, if a new agreement has been signed with the manufacturer, you know, because some of these projects are years long. Mm-hmm. So you might have to change out all your doors kind of quite late
Something
in the
goes
game,
end of life, for example, or kind of like a manufacturer changes something. I mean, as a manufacturer, I mean, you guys produce an incredible amount of material that can't be sitting in a warehouse. It basically has to be shipped to site. If everybody was using your BIM objects, for example, Marcus, I mean, can you use that then to solve this problem, which is better logistics, a better buildability, better on-site construction, better, you know, all that stuff, because it's those real parts?
It would be great. Because if we get the information early from the architect that this material is specified exactly to this bill of material, to this size, we can create a masonry model on it, and we can produce it make to order and put it on stock here. So otherwise, we produce materials where we think they might be used the next 3 to 4 months. So we have it on stock, but we don't know if we really need it. So, and if we have the information as early as possible, and we can say, okay, I can give the advice on the performance of the material, but I can guarantee then exactly the delivery time, because I know it exactly, and I need not to produce it just in time. I can produce it as it fit into my production process. This will be great for us here, and I think for all manufacturers. If you know in advance the need of your product in 2 or 3 month scale, because then you can buy the raw materials, you can adapt your production process. Everything is the most or the best way here to run a company.
So I think
that's an ideal working way, because you have
no stock.
Some fantastic trick that is called value engineering that happens many times and through the process, and is difficult to plan many times. I understand that part of the process. You take risks generating the stock that sometimes is not used. Yeah.
So I think that's a great place to finish. That really, having a BIM model full of BIM objects does actually resolve most of these challenges that we are presented with today, which is a great sales pitch, I think, by myself. Just a big thank you very much to today's speakers and for today's panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. Thank you.